what is communications and internet policy? As we talk to each other, I think the common theme is one that has to do with identifying bottlenecks, gatekeepers, control points that decrease the degree of innovation, decrease the degree of participation, decrease the degree of creativity reflected by the network, and the possibility of using policy to intervene to break up those bottlenecks, to open them up, to improve the flow of information, knowledge, culture, and interaction between people and organizations to leverage the capabilities that the network provides. And this happens at multiple levels in the network, both its physical and logical and human components. So we'll start with Susan. And you have the biographies all in the folders, so I won't introduce. And then go down one after the other just for a few minutes of framing. And then we'll have a conversation that won't be moderated, and therefore probably will actually be more I didn't just say that, did I?
So we've had a joyous morning talking about the opportunities presented by technology for its effect on government, government's possible effect on technology, and the fact sort of in the DNA of the younger generation that internet access is like air and water and electricity, just a utility, something you cannot live without. You can't be part of your community, you can't be in touch with your friends, you can't get access to health information. And yet, as Yochai suggests, we are right now in 2010 at a tremendous tipping point between the dreams of the internet of the past and the consolidation of the internet of the future on several layers. And I just want to sketch out for you where some of those choke points are that are being acted on, real live test cases around the world that policymakers are confronting. Right now, the only two things that make the internet are the fact that your device might have a unique number that attaches to the network and that your device is capable of chunking things into packets. That's all the internet is, an agreement to chunk things into packets and send them to unique places. The numbering system we call right now IPv4, this fourth version of the Internet Protocol numbering system. We're running out of numbers. We've been running out of numbers for years. There's a real shortage. And I was on the ICANN board for 3 years where we had innumerable presentations about the problem and the scarcity of IP numbers. Everybody scratches their head. The incentives are all in the wrong place. Nobody can figure out how we would switch to IPv6. We're so advanced, we skip IPv5. We go right to IPv6. And if we had IPv6 in place, you could address your socks. You could address the refrigerator. Everything could be a sensor. Everything could be attached to the network. A much more vivid, engagement with this thing, which is like electricity and water and air to much of the world. There is right now a push in many corners around the world to have what is really mostly an intergovernmental organization dealing with the allocation of those numbers. This is a choke point for the internet. What power the UN and its subcomponent, the International Telecommunications Unit, would have over the allocation of numbers. This may sound terribly dry to you, but this is blood and guts stuff. This is the moment when you could use access to a number as life or death on the internet. If your home regulator had control over each one of those numbers and could say, you get one, you don't, and you get one if we view your content to be helpful to society, and you don't if we view you to be spreading rumors or somehow undermining the rich society we have in our country, we're going to turn you off. There's a big push by intergovernmental organizations, and particularly the UN, to have control over IPv6 allocation. This has been talked about for years, but it's actually about to be voted on at the ITU plenipotentiary session. And how do we react as a world to this? The system in the past had been, you get an IP address if you have a relationship with your friendly regional internet registry, a largely private body, not staffed by the incumbent telephone companies, and not, most importantly, not connected to a particular border, connected to a particular country. Being able to allocate the numbers using borders reinstantiates the physical world on the internet, brings back the tanks and guns that attach to the physical world into our virtual communications. This is a big step, potentially, and would mean, if it is the UN that's in charge, that NGOs, private businesses, other ordinary citizens wouldn't necessarily have a seat at that table. Jonathan's written beautifully about this, Tim Wu has as well. Lots of people are aware of the rebuilding of borders into cyberspace. So that's a level where things are really happening right now. So government consolidation, China has issued an internet white paper which says the UN should have a leading role in allocation of internet resources, and there are lots of other governments who are interested in that as well. They have good reasons to be interested. You can carry out your policy objectives by having control over numbers, but do we really want to see this? It's one level. I want to talk about one more, which is consolidation, not only in governance, which we're seeing with the numbering system, but also in gatekeepers at the physical layer of internet access. Particularly in the United States, which is the situation where I know the story the best, we're heading towards a world in which truly high-speed access, anything over 6 megabits a second, which you'd need to watch video or do the exciting things the Kennedy School wants to do, will be provided by only your cable monopoly internet access provider. They're the only actor. Yochai will explain that DSL upgrades to fiber are much more expensive than cable being able to put in new electronics and give you really high speeds. The cable guys don't compete with each other. They've divided up the country. So Philadelphia is a Comcast town. San Francisco is a Comcast town. There's some places where Time Warner operates much smaller than Comcast. And so tremendous consolidation, really coming back to a recognition that this probably is a natural monopoly service. Internet access in the United States, right now completely unregulated. The jurisdiction of the Federal Communications Commission is up for grabs. No one really knows what's going on, total chaos, and no clear path at the moment to figuring out how you would bring public values to bear on this monopoly provider of high-speed internet access. We used to think that if you were providing a communication service, you had to make sure everybody got it, you have to make sure it was cheap, and that things like diversity, localism, and other public values we hold dear were part of the story. Not clear where that whole story is going right now. So it couldn't be a more exciting time in communications policy than right now in the United States. But the public is completely unaware of this, and policymakers in Washington have been pretty much overrun by the funding from the telecom operators and cable companies in this country. Comcast is number 4 in contributions in Washington. AT&T is number 1. And it's very risky for a legislator or a policymaker to say anything that goes in the other direction. So I hope I've made your pulses race with how interesting this area is, and how at these 2 layers, in very simple ways, you can see real choke points of control being exerted over a system we thought would empower all human beings around the world to improve their lives by being able to communicate with each other. We're building borders back in and gatekeepers onto the net.
All right, well, let me offer some additional thoughts in the realm of technology policy, specifically as it applies online. You know, my excitement here a decade ago came from the prospect that the distributed intelligence of the internet would cure most ills, at least the ones I was most concerned about. Some things seem to be getting worse, and let me try to give a couple examples there. We've all seen ads that promise things that are just too good to be true. 7 women in Framingham want to date you. It's like, wow, this is looking pretty good, and that's just this morning. Get these free, get totally free, completely free, absolutely free ringtones, click here. Probably not. It continues. How can it be that one sees these ads running through, most of all, the Right Media ad exchange, run, of course, by Yahoo, the biggest banner ad exchange on the whole web, run by a company that has its own lawyers and lobbyists, and somehow gets away with running these ads that, make no mistake about it, are completely false. Everything they say, every word is literally untrue. It is literally false. How can Yahoo get away with selling those? We all know about the Bureau of Standards and Practices that any respectable newspaper would have to vet its ads for facially false statements and to make sure that they don't publish those. Why does Yahoo get away with doing that online, and to be sure others too? Of course, there's an answer to that question. Their lawyers got there first. The Communications Decency Act, Section 230, says a provider of an interactive computer service is not liable for the material that others, such as their advertisers, put there, even if their advertisers paid good money to put it there, even if they charged the deceptive advertisers extra because they knew they were so deceptive, even if they categorized the deceptive ads into 100 different categories of just how terrible they respectively were. And to be sure, when Yahoo went out to categorize these deceptive ads into 100 categories, they did. They say, promises something free that isn't free. Promises something free without an asterisk and some fine print. Makes a claim that isn't possibly true. Buy land on the moon. And you know what? They have ads like that. So this is an interesting example of technology policy. This is the law coming in internet exceptionalism, offering a big benefit to providers of interactive communication services. If you provide an interactive communication service and someone else puts something there that's not true, you don't have to worry about that. You don't have to worry about it one bit. No matter how much money you made, no matter how false it was, it's still not your problem. We've clearly solved one problem. We solved the problem of AOL discussion groups that might occasionally have something terrible on them, and we don't want AOL to be responsible for that when an independent user posted it. So we fixed that problem pretty solidly. But look at this other problem we created, especially for the poor users who get the sense, gee, you can't believe everything you read on the internet. Maybe I'll just do my purchasing in stores rather than online. And regular people, not the kind of people who come to conferences about technology, regular people seem like they might be starting to say that. All right, so there's a powerful gatekeeper in the form of ad networks who are enjoying a particular aspect of technology policy and really using this remarkable law as a shield to defend themselves against liability that others similarly situated, such as newspapers, would otherwise face. In the realm of online advertising, of course, the big news seems to be Google's dominance. We hear numbers like 72% in the United States, 72% of searches running through Google ad revenue, even higher than that in the search ad context. And in other countries, of course, in UK, Netherlands, Germany, Spain, goes on, you get countries where Google's market share is 97%, 98%. Sort of wonder how much higher it can get. Does this counter have a triple-digit function? It's headed right in that direction. So I've been working recently on a set of projects to try to figure out what can go wrong when market share of this one vendor gets so high. On one hand, of course, we think advertisers, being big companies, don't need the kinds of consumer protections that we think consumers need. On the other hand, as between Qantas selling plane tickets and Google selling advertising services, first of all, Google probably makes more money selling Qantas's plane tickets than Qantas makes selling Qantas's plane tickets, which is remarkable, but true in many industries. There are lots of dentists who make less money than Google makes referring customers to those dentists, so it's not just about the airline business. Of course, when you have 10 advertisers all with similar business models bidding against each other to get to the top of the page, they can bid away all the profits, and then the ad platform gets a windfall. Should anything be done about that? Can we style that as an antitrust claim? I'm not quite sure. Charging high prices in and of itself is not an antitrust problem in the United States. It might be exploitative in Europe, but we're not in Europe. They're doing what they're doing over there. Separately, of course, there's the question of, folks have called it search neutrality or search bias. If you go to Google and you search for the keyword mail, M-A-I-L, mail, what should come up as the first algorithmic result? If we go to Yahoo and you type in mail, Yahoo Mail comes up first. If you go to Bing and you type in mail, Hotmail doesn't come up first. Usually mail.com comes up first. At least their domain name matches your search term. And if you go to Google, wouldn't you know it, Gmail comes up first. So too for everything else. If you type in maps at Google, Google Maps comes up first. If you type in any stock ticker symbol, Google always thinks they have the best information about that stock ticker. Sometimes there's a big map that pops up or some other kind of a specialized box, sometimes just regular algorithmic results. Well, if you had a business that was predicated on Google sending you algorithmic traffic for free, you'd be very disappointed if one day Google decided they were going to offer a travel service, and rather than sending you plane ticket buyers for free, they're going to charge you $20 per lead to send you those same customers. On the other hand, maybe you were crazy to run your business around the idea that Google was going to give you this traffic for free. Why would they do that? It's just by accident that they haven't gotten around to charging you yet, and as soon as they do, you'll be paying through your nose. So there definitely is some pressure here, some complaints building, not just from strange little companies with no lawyers, but from MapQuest, which is AOL, and from Expedia, which is Barry Diller and Interactive Corp, and on down the line from Yelp, like a lover scorned, angry at not having managed to do the deal with Google, and so, of course, upset when Google gives them less traffic. Well, we've got Jonathan here.
Good morning, everybody.
Hi.
You know that nightmare you might have sometimes? A place you need to be, and then you wake up and it's too late and you're racing to be there? After 18 years, my dreams have come true.
Poor guy.
I gotta say, it doesn't feel yet as bad as I thought it would after all those years. So, I just have to apologize for violating the Woody Allen rule, which says that 90% of life is just showing up. My hope is that we can... Thank you very much, Susan. You're right, it can get worse. So, my hope is on this panel to work for the other 10%, because 10% must be something else other than showing up. And I can't think
We've
of
already self-organized.
3 friends better able to help us do it than Susan, Ben, and Yochai. So
Susan's already spoken.
I've already spoken.
Ben
I can speak
is Ben is in
Coming to a close.
coming to a close. But you've come for the part that...
you know, there's also that
fantastic.
second realization that life kind of just goes right on without you. No one is indispensable. Yeah. Ben, please finish up, and I've got some very tough questions for you, too.
I think I will turn it over to Yochai and be in his capable hands. Please.
That was abrupt. Several things. Theme that we've been talking about has been bottlenecks. Susan talked about IPv4, IPv6 transition, control there, and the US particular monopolization toward cable. Ben talked about particularly advertising and the relative power to control advertising and clear commerce in that way. I want to just plug in a few more of these components and then that's what we, as we were talking before, we're talking about. So bottlenecks appear in all sorts of places. If you imagine as the way that Susan initially described the net as just a way of agreeing on how to packetize things and send them around, thereby creating a very open environment that allows for tremendous flexibility on all of its ends, potential bottlenecks can emerge. So one, just expanding, if we start from the physical transport layer, just expanding on what Susan talked about the US, I think it's a reflection of a broader change in the core technological business assumptions that underlay liberalization and privatization throughout the world since the early 90s and through roughly the last year or two. Mm-hmm. So next generation, so the basic assumption behind liberalization was that the incremental investment from where telephone and cable were to high-speed internet was small enough so as not to require natural monopoly and equal enough for cable, telephone, electricity, terrestrial wireless, satellite to allow for facilities-based competition. What's emerging is that the long-term, lowest cost, highest productivity infrastructure is fiber. But fiber is very expensive because you need to essentially send backhoes. About 85% of the cost is sending backhoes and people. Whereas cable can upgrade with electronics up to, at the moment, 160 megabits, probably in increments of 160 for quite a bit more at much lower prices. Just to give you a sense, the price per new, for DOCSIS 3.0, the price for a new, the cost to the company of a new line for high-speed internet over cable is between 70 and 100 bucks a person. The cost for Fios is between 1,500 and 2,500 per household. That's inconsistent with continued facilities-based competition, which is why in the US we see AT&T and Qwest for a long time saying they're not going there, and Verizon saying, we started, sorry, we're not continuing until we fill up. As a practical matter, what that's done in the last 4 or 5 years in a lot of countries at the regulatory level is a move away from we're all going towards just unregulated competition to 6 out of the OECD 30 countries moving to structural separation. That is to say, bringing back ways we thought about things as innovative in the 80s. Australia moving to a national broadband, and just the last election continued in that direction. That's to say, a government-funded national infrastructure that then will get privatized on an open access model. Switzerland, you're seeing massive investment by municipalities that is then matched by Swisscom, which is itself over 50% owned by the federal government. Sweden, everything going through municipalities, tremendous government investment, and an increase in open access. Again, because of the sense that it may be that in the transition to gigabit speeds, we're going to lose that possibility of real facilities-based competition. That challenges a core drive of telecoms policy. At the device level, one of the things, and then you've got wireless, absolutely central as an alternative platform. The National Broadband Plan says we need 500 megahertz out there in order to support it. But again, the tradition from mobile phones is one of fully proprietary networks running on proprietary standards with proprietary devices. So you've got controlled systems that are alongside each other and maybe competing to a greater or lesser extent in more or less oligopolistic competition, but they're not the open internet. So one of the things that you're seeing now is net neutrality. The debate over net neutrality and whether or not it extends to wireless is a function of that. Because as mobile broadband becomes more important, as getting more wireless becomes more important, the question of whether or not you can open that up becomes critical. Then you move up one layer. To standards. You have questions. You heard Anish this morning talking about standards and standard setting as a core intervention. You've got questions of how you bring people together. One of the most interesting and shall we call it aggressive or at least ambitious moves is the one that Nelly Cross brought over from competition in the EU to digital economy when she changed roles as commissioner, was to say, what if we have a de facto standard? This begins to be a cousin of what you're interested with regard to Google. What if we have a proprietary standard that becomes, as a practical matter, a matter of market share, required for everyone? Is that enough on a competition-like model, that is to say antitrust-like model, but not through antitrust law, but through telecoms regulation, to require that standard to become open, either on some form of royalty or not? Does that become the issue because you're trying to open it? And then jumping all the way up and just putting it on the table for the conversation later, we have the question of control over existing culture as a control point, and it reaching back down. So just this last year and a half, we've had Adopi passed in France. We've had the new digital economy law in the UK. Both of them having the idea that you can leverage internet service providers as extrajudicial means of shutting down services to people who don't comply with copyright laws that, if we're talking about who's investing in law, are overexpansive for the current business models of cultural production and distribution, but reflect rent-seeking from 20th century incumbent models, basically recording industry and Hollywood in particular. So you're beginning to see, and then you've got the question of ACTA and an international treaty trying to generalize some of the more aggressive forms of hyper-strong IP to the trade system and replicate a lot of what the power of TRIPS is with regard to patents, also in the context of copyright, but also reaching from the content control into regulating the technology through DRM and through ISP services. So more generally, the theme of various control points at which either law is the source of the control point, as it is, say, in Digital Millennium Copyright Act, DRM, or laws like ADOP and the UK law, or law, at least in principle, could be a mechanism for opening things up.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. So let's work our way back up the stack, starting at the bottom from your presentation. Am I right in hearing then that there's a way in which it was the good old days when it was modems and DSL and coax? Boy, that was competition. And what you're saying is, however much that was competition, you foresee much less ahead because even the legacy coaxial cable that's now carrying bits at pretty high speed, at least around Cambridge, Comcast, if you pay them enough, they'll give you a decent connection. You're saying that's all going to give way to fiber, and generally one firm lays fiber, and that's where we stand?
No, not necessarily. Okay. So back up. One, are those the good old days? They're the good old days in the sense of competition and open internet. This is before coaxial, right? When you're talking real dial-up, you've got a physical network that's a common carrier by law. You've got a decision not to charge ISP, to treat ISPs as businesses rather than carriers, which means, I'm sorry if this is too much in the weeds, which means they get, their pricing is flat pricing, just like the corner grocery, which means they can turn around and sell flat pricing to people in terms of connection, and you've got a common carrier physical layer with ISP service with 5,000 ISPs and a lot of competition. The only problem is it's crappy speed. So you need some investment.
Pretty big problem.
Which is a pretty big problem. So you get some increase in speed, which requires more investment, which then results in consolidation and a smaller number. And the question is how you maintain competition.
But most of your worries here are still prospective then. Because if I had to decide between 5,000 ISPs, all of which go really slowly, and today maybe one or two choices for high-speed broadband, possibly narrowing to one in some areas, but really high speed, so far it's a no-brainer, right? You're just saying that prospectively there could be discrimination.
Well, actually, if I could jump in here, this relates to a question that was asked yesterday. We don't want government involved in the internet. That's going to slow down investment and innovation. I think what Yochai is trying to point out here is that government intervention created this sidewalk, this substrate that allowed for a reliable transmission layer on which lots of things could happen, not just competitive ISPs, but anybody could introduce a new thingy without asking permission from the network carrier. What Yochai is suggesting is that because of the natural monopoly characteristics of the single pipe to the home, we're getting to a world in which everything is completely private with no government intervention, just a giant pipe that can be sliced, diced, prioritized, timed, a little ka-ching for everything you do online.
Now this takes us...
And that actually is not a prospective concern. That's today. That's the worry that's going on. So.
As is the speed and the price. Right. The fact that in places that had greater competition through a requirement to open infrastructure is exactly what we found when we did our study, that you have the highest speeds, lower prices in places that had effective infrastructure sharing. It just becomes much harder when the cost transition is that much higher and you don't even have two technologies. At least you had copper and coaxial, and then you could open the copper and get some competition at least in Europe.
But now for each of you, enter the Google Verizon framework, which is a rather odd document, not easiest to understand exactly where it's coming from. But at least there, you pointed out why it's half a loaf, that it doesn't yet speak to wireless one way or the other. But for wired, doesn't this proposed framework say, we agree that for wired networks there should be net neutrality?
No, actually. The Google Verizon discussion allows for a special, completely unregulated area, which would be something called special services or managed services. Now, the visual here should just be one big pipe, right? And Verizon, along with other companies, would like to say that they'll give you some internet access, which might be a little bit of that water.
And for which there would be net neutrality.
And for which there would be net neutrality. But what about the rest of it? It becomes sort of a moment it's such a giant exception. It's like, it's not just the exception swallowing the rule, it's the exception eating the rule, going out and buying more rules. And it's amazing.
You've anthropomorphized this exception.
Well, because one problem we have with telecommunications policy for both policymakers and the general public is that it doesn't have enough of an emotional connection. We haven't figured out
So creating a monster is a, yeah.
We need the inconvenient truth for internet policy. We don't have that. Al Gore standing up there with all those PowerPoints, dying dolphins. We don't have that because it's too abstract for people to understand. But
Well, I'd be delighted to nominate each of you for a Nobel Peace Prize. But
I'm not going for that. I just want.
But just on the specialized services point, and then we'll move up the stack a little bit more. On the specialized services point, I gather it's at least extremely vague. We don't really know what it means by the text of it. Maybe you've got a sense
I've
from
got
past.
a sense of what's
but at
going
least one past specialized service is over coaxial cable, where you get, these days, your high-speed internet service from Comcast. There also happens to be this old legacy product called cable TV that goes into a cable box that I get from the cable company, and it's sharing the space. And the idea would be we could have net neutrality for the internet that comes over that coax, but we don't need net neutrality for HBO and Showtime,
Well,
right?
but change the visual image. The cable company would say, we'll give you net neutrality for 6 megahertz, like one channel of that pipe, and the rest of it is ours. And if that's the case, and the rest of it is just IP flow, some of it could be television programs, a lot of it will be sports. People love sports, they can't live without it, but it could also be other interactive services. It's all IP, we can't think of it as a segmented, here's a legacy service, here's something else. It's just one big connection. That's how the incumbents see it. It's a big bundled service that can be sold that makes it possible for them to get more rents from the entire process.
Got it.
Okay.
One last point?
The point is about the political dynamic.
Yeah.
I think one thing that was interesting about the last decade is that you had a coalition of firms in the cloud and public interest organizations pushing for a neutral physical layer that would not be a rent extraction point from the perspective of the cloud companies and would not be a control anti-democratic point from the perspective of the users. What the Google-Verizon deal did was take the core pillar of the cloud companies and put it in the other column. It basically read to someone like me as we are sufficiently concerned about the wireless mobile net and our place on it, including our play with Verizon and with Android and with all of that, to be willing to trade. And what are we willing to trade? We're willing to trade exactly the same fuzzy boundaries that were so contested when Verizon raised them and AT&T raised them as objections to the FCC's rulemaking, are the things that we'll leave as fuzzy terms. But we preemptively give up the major expansion that the FCC was suggesting, which is it's all internet, whether it's wireless or wired. And so that strong signal of the potential fraying of the political arena is, I also thought was very important about that deal, much more important than the details
Yes.
of what was said in any of the words.
It has been interesting to see that the way the FCC has read the deal has been not as a deal at all, but instead to say everything that Verizon gave up, which is to say acknowledging there should be net neutrality for wired, minus whatever exception we were just talking about for the specialized services. Great. Now there's consensus about all of that, so we can lock that in, but there's still debate about the wireless part. Now let's talk about that. So I guess this is a story that will have
We'll
multiple
figure out who
chapters,
played whom.
Right.
nationally and internationally, or it's like Mousetrap, who was the killer at the end
And
of the...
speaking internationally, these things that happen in the United States do have extensive spillover effects in other countries. Somebody, a regulator from Mexico, told me last week, you're doing this with the cable monopoly? That's giving our cable monopoly the opportunity to say, oh, it must be good. It's happening in the United States. So these are not isolated regimes. And so as Yochai's wonderful report for the Berkman Center said, we should be getting some of this spillover effect from other countries' approaches to open access. We should be listening to them, and they're also listening to us. It's having a deep effect.
Let's move up one bit in the stack and then open it up. And that by moving it up, we work Ben in a little bit because it's funny, in the realm in which, Ben, you've been doing a lot of your work, when we think about internet, we think about non-proprietary protocols, but not developed publicly in the sense of government. There's some third force by which these protocols come about and then are shared openly. Ben, for your work and the problems you see prevalent in ad networks and such, these tend to be protocols, functions that aren't developed by government, but aren't exactly the protocols themselves proprietized. To fix the problems you see, is it government intervention to solve it or some other means?
So it is really messy. The kinds of bias that you'll get publishers and advertisers angry about don't really lend themselves to government intervention because you'd feel you don't have the right information to make a decision. What should come up first when you type in mail? Gee, I'm not sure. If you type in videos in Germany, should we give you the video site that is most popular in Germany or the video site that's fastest growing or fastest growing among people who went to college? The people who use internet access more than 20 hours a week, they get to vote on what comes up first. It's not a place we want to go. But there are some principles of tactics we don't much like. Bundling and tying sometimes get people's attention. So here's one. If you're Google and you want to make sure your web search is the default web search on every mobile device, guy gets a new cell phone, maybe it's an Android cell phone, maybe it isn't. You want to make sure that when he runs a search, he uses Google and not Bing and not anything else. What can you do to make that happen? The first thing you could do is say it's not Android unless it has Google search as the default. Now you might think Android is an open standard, anyone can take that open source code and use it. Oh, you can, except it won't connect to the Google App Store unless Google approves it. And Google can issue a stop ship order telling you not to ship your cell phone because it's not genuine Android. And sure enough, they did this as to Motorola just last month, leading Motorola to abandon.
So they do by trademark what Apple does by tech.
It's a combination of trademark and there is some server side. It's like DRM where they know what device you're using. They check that device's model number against the list of permissible devices.
Right.
Here's another one that's even closer to classic antitrust. Maybe there are competitors for web search, actually. Bing is a pretty good substitute for Google search, especially on your mobile device, people seem to think. I'm not sure if my house was on fire and I forgot what number to call for that. I'd rather have Google than Bing still. Okay, but even so, people
Another kind of lurid scenario.
We're doing the best we can.
An inconvenient
I'm
truth.
competing with Susan here. An additional area where Google has market power is on these video sites. What is the competitor to YouTube exactly in the United States? Where can you go to watch the kinds of things that people watch on YouTube? There really is no other single site. So here is what Google has done. I have this on good authority from multiple sources, none of which will put their name to it, but ask your friendly Google buddies whether they will deny it or not. Google will tell a carrier, you must put the YouTube app on the front page. Oh, you wanted that anyway. Okay, so you're going to take the YouTube app. Guess what? If you take the YouTube app, you must put the Google search app as the front and default and only search app on your mobile phone. So it turns out they now think their market power in mobile is not in search, where we thought they were powerful, but in videos. Anyway, you take your power in one thing, you use it to get more power in another.
Sounds like the Microsoft case of many years ago.
Well, at least there was a pro-competitive justification there, that it was always handy to have a web browser. And when I was your IT guy a decade ago, I was
good times.
I was always happy when you had a web browser and I didn't have to come and install it, because I knew that, in fact, the whole office had them and Microsoft had taken care of that for me. Here, I haven't quite heard what the advantage is to a consumer in having the device manufacturer not have the opportunity to substitute best of breed in each vein. Maybe there is an explanation. As to web browsers, of course, Microsoft's argument was ultimately deemed pretty hollow, and we get browser ballot screens in Europe, at least.
Now, you've come up with some things that shouldn't be done and that potentially government could do. And I guess even in government regulation, there's regulation. A rule is promulgated and enforced by a public authority. I guess there's also private right of action. And am I right that you basically have sued Google?
Not about any of this stuff. It's
about other stuff.
Our esteemed friends at Skyhook, who I have no ties to, of course, filed antitrust litigation last week as to the stop ship order on the Motorola phone, where their software was banned from being on the phone on penalty of Google denying that phone access to the Android App Store.
Yeah.
I've sued Google about their typo squatting practices, where they're making $500 million a year from infringing on people's trademarks in violation of the ACPA. But I think that's a different story.
Totally different thing.
Good fun.
Got it. We should open it up. Let me just make one observation, which is that so far, all of these things we're talking about, tricky, messy, as you say, Ben, but not immune or inured inherently to effective government regulation. These are fairly large elephants we want to harpoon in a friendly way and get to, behave in the circus arena on their hind legs the way they should. It's not as if it's a Napster kind of problem where, oh, the internet is global and everybody's anonymous. These are known quantities that we could regulate. There's just the public choice problem that...
Well, I also raised the IPv6 issue, which is actually also a very messy issue, and not necessarily one that's going to be, there's no clear policy path to getting that right.
And for which Ben has done a bit of work too, is to literally when we're going to run out.
So the question, Susan gave us one side of the IPv6 problem, the question of to what extent the ITU will be your source of IPv6 addresses. Of course, there are so many addresses to be given out in the IPv4 context. What, 2 to the 128th? Can anyone think through what that number is?
Lots of zeros.
It's bigger than anything we have a name for by a lot. A Googles, and then it continues after that.
Yeah.
Well, there's also the question of how we're going to get into an IPv6 world where the websites you want to reach actually have IPv6 addresses. And, we could all hire Paul to do this for us, which he would be happy to do.
The solution's coming.
The solution is coming.
Good.
The fact of the matter is, if your computer has a v4 address only, and God help you, the site you want to reach has a v6 address only, you're going to need a translation server. The translation is kind of messy because it looks a lot like a man-in-the-middle attack for HTTPS purposes. You've got a server that is translating this to that. And you're going to have a hard time proving that you're really talking to the site you wanted to be talking to.
I could also see just a total consumer abusing thing, like the era in which from the cable switchover from antenna to cable, they were having on late night TV, buy this Schrombus box that will do it. You can see the IPv4 v6 Schrombus box.
It's an upgrade, right?
Exactly.
And there may be such things. What I've tried to do with Aaron is design a market mechanism whereby those who have extra v4 addresses will sell them to those who desperately need them. This is a challenge because our regulatory regime to date has always said it is a moral abomination to sell your v4 address. These addresses are given, not sold, and you keep them as long as you need them. Then on some date certain, we flip the rule to sell it to anyone you want, just file this handy form and pay us $100. We're going to make that switch nonetheless because we have to as a practical matter.
But even that is viewed as a
necessary.
stopgap. IPv6, you think, has to be the future.
Yes, but we had a decade ago, I guess when I was in junior high school, we ran out of IP addresses. We ran
At your junior high school?
No, we ran out of addresses in the world before CIDR, before this system of cutting up the addresses more precisely. The addresses only came in 3 sizes, 2 to the 8th, 2 to the 16th, 2 to the 24th. We ran out of blocks of 2 to the 16th. Then we came up with a way of dividing them up more finely, and lo and behold, it lasted 15 years.
Too bad we can't do Zeno's paradox for IPv4 addresses and just keep cutting them in half.
I do
We
wonder.
really want to get there, John.
Yeah.
It would be interesting if IPv4 lasts another decade. If transfer markets make IPv4 last another decade, on balance, we would have done a lot of good, even though it was going to be a painful problem at the end of that decade.
So, Susan, is there anything you would do to regulate IPv6 happening more quickly? Can it self-organize itself? Or?
Well, Larry Strickling and Anish Chopra are going to have a big event on Tuesday to encourage people to move to IPv6 addresses. We have the sort of initiative problem. What are the incentives for business to actually spend the money unless they want to hire Paul and get his solution, to have potentially concurrent systems running both IPv4 and v6. Other countries did this just by mandate. In the United States, we're trying to drive the push by saying if you're a vendor to the US government, you've got to use v6. So what I would do to make sure this happens, would be to use the bully pulpit of the White House, which is what they're doing.
And
There's
the
not much
intended
else that
audience
can be
is
done.
not individuals. If somebody wanted to help right now and be like, I'm ready to go IPv6 for the good of humankind, not helpful. It's sort of the larger firms, the Googles of the world and others that...
Yeah, that would drive. It's just like when we change something for Medicaid, it changes the entire medical insurance system. If you change something for the government effectively, it really does have a giant impact.
Got it.
So, Paul.
Paul.
So I do feel an obligation to respond a little bit, and especially since I think the goal here is to